we are pleased to bring back Dr. Christopher Thornberg this year. I'm not even going to go into it. I know we're a little bit behind, so I'm going to give you the power.
Well, that's fine. Yeah.
We were backstage for the last 15 minutes telling me, what was wrong in my data.
I know.
No, actually, the one thing we talked about is I truly believe that we should be at MSA.
No, wrong one. The other one. Sorry. The other one. There you go, right there. There you go. Perfect.
We good?
Yeah, we're good. Thank you so much. Sorry, Jason.
Thank you. Go for it.
All right. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Really, honestly, good afternoon. It's supposed to be good morning, but we're running a couple minutes behind, right? But then again, what conference doesn't run a couple minutes behind? We do have a lot to talk about. I do want to say, so I drove up here this morning, and I guess that soulless patch of concrete known as the 210 was blocked up. So it actually routed me up through the 14 onto the Pear Blossom Highway. And man, I got to tell you, driving across that road on a beautiful morning like this reminds me of why you want to live up here. What a stunningly gorgeous morning. Honestly, it doesn't feel like LA at all when you're driving on this side of the hill, as the case may be. But it is nice to be back. Quick refresher. If you remember, I have a little company out there, speaking of soulless patches of concrete, in the city of Los Angeles called Beacon Economics. I've been running my company for almost 20 years now, and our game has always been to try and give people the truth as we can best ascertain from economic theory and the data we examine, as opposed to just selling you any idea you particularly want to pay for, as the case may be. Now, I always knew that vision was going to be a challenge, but little did I know how much more challenging it was going to be over the next 20 years of running this particular business. And if you see me over the last couple of years, you know I have a new way of looking at the world. And today, yet again, we're going to be talking about two distinct things. We're going to talk a lot about what we think is happening in our world, and then we're going to talk about what's actually happening in our world. And I appreciate that those are supposed to be the same thing, but what I've started to realize is they are not. And it's not random that our narratives and our realities should drift apart. In fact, quite the opposite. There's a lot of new research into how people think and how we make decisions that give us a good, strong clue as to what's going on. But the key to this whole thing, if you want to be a forecaster, you have to pay attention to narratives and reality as two distinct things. The reason for that's very simple. It is narratives that determine choices, the choices of households, the choices of policymakers, the choices of course, business leaders, but it is economic reality that determines the outcome of those particular choices. And in the end, it's a very simple rule. Good choices and smart policy start with the right narrative, and the biggest problem we have in our world right now is we are surrounded by bad narratives. We're just absolutely surrounded by them. And, you want to talk about bad narratives. How about my fair field and the narratives we've been spinning? You remember back in 2019, we had the real estate recession that was going to happen at any particular point in time? Of course it didn't. And in 2020, it was a pandemic depression. Mind you, it was an 8-week recession before the economy started leaping back. In 2021, as the economy was back to normal, we were told there was never going to be a recovery. And in 2022, we were told that every household had to choose between feeding grandma and driving to work, when in fact, the economy was rocking and rolling. In 2023, it was a yield curve recession we were going to have. I got to tell you, all these ridiculous headlines made me really start to worry in 2024 when I found out we were the envy of the world. I'm like, uh-oh. So needless to say, I was a little bit relieved when in 2025, we're back to calling the recession. This time, of course, it's the trade war. All this reminds me that the only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. Now, with that being said, last year's political narrative was also very interesting. You remember, no one has any idea who's going to win this election. It is a coin toss, said Nate Silver from 538. We can't possibly know what's going to happen. And of course, what happened was a complete hard right shift. There was no doubt about it. Even in here in California, you saw us turn right. The $18 minimum wage was voted down. I never thought I would see the the day when California will vote down, of course, the minimum wage. And that brings me to my new expression, which is the only function of election polling is to make economic forecasting look respectable. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Now, as you all know, we have not been buying into all this pessimistic nonsense. We've been relatively optimistic on the economy, and I'd like to say relatively right on things. And the reason is very simple. Look, the economy will continue to grow as long as household finances remain strong, and household finances have been wonderful over the past bunch of years. Now, the economy has cooled a bit from the insanity we saw in 2022 when our stimulus-laden economy was running at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Yes, it's calmed down from white hot to something resembling normalcy. But that being said, inflation's cooled off, credit supply is up, the Fed has been backing off, and with all that said, household finances still look good. So the economy still looks solid. But I am worried. Why am I worried? I'm worried largely because why household finances look so good. Households feel like they have a lot of income because we don't have to pay taxes. You know, all the money that goes to the federal government to provide us all those wonderful services we get. Our incomes are high because we have a massive federal deficit. And at the same time, our net worth is at an all-time high level, but that's being driven by the asset bubble we're in the middle of. So what you really are seeing in the U.S. economy is an economy that is actually in the process of slowly but steadily overheating, and you see that in the external accounts. You see that in the current account deficit. And what's interesting is the rest of the world doesn't seem to have any idea about this because the dollar is at an all-time high level. So it's an interesting equilibrium we're in. Now, of course, the brand new administration is here, and man, has it been a couple of months, has it not? I've never seen the news cycle move quite as fast as it has over the last 10 weeks. And I don't need to go through the headlines. And yes, policy uncertainty is going through the roof. The stock market took a brief dive last week. You might have caught the data from the GDP Now, which says we could have a negative 2% for the first quarter. Now, this isn't quite what it seems. Basically, some of this is a big surge in imports because people are trying to get ahead of tariffs. And then there was a big surge of people bringing gold into the country, which really isn't even an import. So it's just noise, right? But here's the key. What do we make of the Trump administration, and what does it mean for the economy? Well, right off the bat, look, Trump's win was not a mandate. Okay, it's as simple as that. It was not. And there's a very simple reason for that. If you look at the voting polls, over a third of people who went to the polls this year were independent. They weren't voting for either party. So the majority of people going to the polls this year were not a member of either party. Ergo, neither party has a mandate at this particular point in time. What did they vote on? It was a protest vote. That's different. A protest vote is not a mandate, as the case may be. Now, Trump's there, and I would tell you that he's shaking things up. Unlike the last administration, he's shaking it up. And I would tell you it's always good to shake up the status quo a little bit. I don't have a problem with that. But with that being said, let's keep something in mind. A president doesn't have absolute authority. We have a system which basically allocates most of the decision-making not to the presidential office, but to Congress and the Senate, the legislative branches. And the reality is, for all the shakeups going on in Washington, D.C. right now, these are temporary. There's no permanent change going on because presidential mandates only last as long as the president does. It's as simple as that. So this is not real change. It's as simple as that. Now, with that said, I am worried about this administration. But I'm not worried about what they're doing. I'm worried about what they're not doing. Because what they're not doing is dealing with the sources of those unsustainable household finances. In other words, they're not going to deal with the bubble, and they're not going to deal with the deficit. And for anybody in the audience who's a Trump fan, that's not a criticism of just Trump, because Biden wasn't doing anything about it either. This is a reflection of politics in our era, because politics in our era wrap around the idea that the American public feels like their lives aren't good, even though Americans have had it better than ever before, and if anything, it looks like we're over-consuming, we're overdoing it. And that fundamental dichotomy between what Americans think and what we're demanding of our politicians versus the reality, well, therein, of course, lies the real rub in our world today. Now, the key is, how does this thing shake out? And work with me here just for a second. One of the things about shaking up the status quo in an economy that is clearly unbalanced is you may well cause a mild recession. Yes, you could cause a mild recession by creating an enormous, shall we say, shock to our trade systems through a big trade war. You could also do it through massive budget cuts. That could also set off a mild recession, which wouldn't be good, but it may not be bad either. Because understand that if we just continue on the current path, which is too much government borrowing, too much consumer spending, and external accounts that are opening up wider and wider and wider, well, at some point in time, that could snap back and create something much worse than a mild recession in 2025. So I don't know exactly how this is going to shake out. There's way too much uncertainty. But what I will tell you is that we had a recession this year. It may not be a bad thing. It may not be a bad thing for the U.S. economy over a longer-term horizon, as the case may be. But we just don't know at this particular point in time. Though all you can say is it's going to continue to be a bouncy road, and you just better be aware. Now, with all that said, as always, I got way too much information in here. I'm going to buzz through all sorts of stuff. For those of you who would like a copy of these slides, don't try to take pictures because I got way too much to go through. At the very end, when I'm wrapping up, there will be a QR code. Have your phone ready to get a picture of that, and away you go. All right? So, riding right into it. Since I was with you last year, the economy's been rocking and rolling, just like I told you it was going to. Growth over the last year was about 2.8% overall. Good, solid numbers. But the biggest source of growth, of course, continued to be consumer spending. And yes, consumers continue to party like rock stars. Record level of foreign travel, restaurant sales, 50% above where they were pre-pandemic. Las Vegas, never been busier. There's been some shifting in the numbers. We are responding to relative prices. The prices of cars are down, we're buying more cars. The prices of recreational goods are down, we're buying a little bit more of that. On the other hand, the price of housing and restaurants has gone up, so we're buying a little less of that. But in general, things are fine. The numbers are still good. And even when you look a little closer, I just told you that auto sales are up, but if you're an auto guy, you're like, no, they're not. We're only selling 1.3 million units per month, where before the pandemic it was 1.45. How can we be selling more cars? Well, you got to be careful how you look at the numbers. On the right-hand side is the average value of cars sold, and I inflation adjusted that, so that's real. And prior to the pandemic, the average car was $65,000. Today it's $80,000. So the real answer here is we're buying fewer cars, but nicer cars. And you see that in a lot of places in the U.S., wine and cars and all sorts of other things. Yes, we've seen a bit of an increase in credit card delinquencies and auto delinquencies, but credit card and auto debt are actually substantially lower than they were prior to the Great Recession or even prior to the pandemic. This is a symptom of an economy slowing down, not a systemic problem driven by, of course, people having too much debt. And overall, foreclosures, bankruptcies remain low. Overall, debt servicing remains low. American finances look great. Labor markets have cooled, but they still look nice and strong. Wages continue to rise. Ask anybody in restaurants or grocery stores, they'll explain to you how their labor costs are going through the roof at this particular point in time. And poverty rates have gone to a very low level. This boat, as tide has lifted all boats, as the case may be. Even our fair state of California, boy, in this election last year, anytime someone wanted to say something bad about the left, they pointed at California as the primary example of everything that goes wrong in a communist economy. And look, this state makes me crazy. Don't get me wrong. I get it. But this is a little over the top. We haven't been growing as fast as other states, certainly not as fast as so in Texas. And yes, some of that is problems in tech and manufacturing. And our labor markets are a little softer than the rest of the nation. But with that, our GDP growth is growing faster. Our income growth is growing faster. We're growing on the intensive margin much more better. It's worth noting that California's a poverty rate, again, near all-time low levels. And take a look at the right-hand side. Now, this is household income growth between 2019 and 2023, and it's Hispanic and black households that have seen the biggest increases in incomes. And isn't that a nice change, right? To see, yes, we're moving towards equality. It doesn't mean things are fixed, but it's nice to see things moving in the right direction. Yet all we hear is how California's poverty rate is soaring to all-time high levels. That's all-time high levels? What are we talking about here, right? These narratives are weird. The real problem in California is the fact that we don't have enough people. Look, over the course of the last 5 years or so, this state has added about 400,000 jobs, but we've only added about 100,000 workers, which all by itself is kind of a neat trick when you think about it. And you want to talk about Texas versus California, it's a conversation about one thing and one thing only: housing. They build housing, we don't. Plus, they have population growth, and we don't. And they have labor force growth, and we don't. And they have job growth, and we don't. It's not complicated. You want more workers, you got to have more people. And take a look at these numbers. In the last 5 years, California's labor force hasn't even grown 1%. Texas and Arizona have grown at 10% and 8% respectively. That's driving the show right there, no more, no less. And of course, when you think about California, again, some of the biggest growth rates we're seeing out there is absolutely places that have labor force growth. We've discussed this quite a bit. Take a look at this number. The Inland Empire, these two counties have added 25% of the jobs in this state over the last 5 years. These two counties by themselves, 1/4 of all jobs. You think Sacramento would pay a little more attention to the Inland Empire, wouldn't you? And of course, again, the growth out here is driven by the greater than most other places. Labor force growth you see seeing on. And it's not just the growth, it's on the extensive margin, also the intensive margin. Take out the household incomes. Look at the household incomes. Some of the biggest increases in city-level household incomes are Stockton, Fresno, Long Beach, Bakersfield, Riverside. Some of the biggest numbers, much better than San Jose or San Francisco. Again, a nice little turn there. And, of course, the biggest increases in unemployment rates are really in coastal areas that are having problems with, for example, tech and manufacturing. Again, not these inland areas. The jobs out here continue to grow at a solid rate, slowing down a bit. Again, we're right at the edge of running out of workers. Unemployment rates are very low out here. Wages continue to rise. No increases in subprime credit score, which again suggests that the gains in our area are really being felt by a lot of different households. Things are working in the right direction. Household incomes. Looking at Riverside and San Bernardino, take a look at these numbers. Riverside just hit 90, and San Bernardino just hit 85. And looking up here in the high desert, take a look at some of these numbers. Again, very solid numbers, particularly in Apple Valley and Hesperia. Over the last 5 years, a 50% increase in household income. 50% in 5 years. Take a look at those numbers. Very, very solid, as the case may be. As for population declines, I've mentioned this the last couple of years. We keep hearing about people fleeing the state of California. They're not fleeing. I know they're not fleeing because there's no houses to move into. Okay? It's as simple as that. If people were fleeing, vacancy rates would be going up. The real issue here, of course, is that we have fewer people, more households, and that is being driven by a decline in people per household. And you see that everywhere in California. Why is there an increase in people, a decrease in people per household? That's a sign of prosperity. That is a sign of prosperity right there, right? The three worst things any human being can live with are cockroaches, bed bugs, and anybody you're not related to, okay? Not necessarily even in that order, as the case may be. Ergo, when people do a little better, they start moving out, and this, again, is a sign of prosperity. And that's true even in multifamily space. Now, the spreading out and the pushing out is warping our labor force. There's no doubt about it. We're getting older, we're getting more educated, but of course industries that need less educated younger workers are really struggling because they have no one to hire right now. Go back to the challenges we're seeing in terms of payrolls in supermarkets and restaurants and stuff like this. Ultimately, the solution, more permits, and the one thing we haven't really fixed in the state of California is housing permits. And if you take a look here in the high desert, approaching 250,000 households, roughly 3 people per household. Yep, that's nearing up. Well, this is just our small area. We did not extend this all the way out to Barstow, but we're looking at about 500,000 people, about 750,000 people. I take it back. This is actually bigger than the number, so I'm not sure what they're counting in here. It's very hard to talk about something. It was funny because Jason was talking about you need an MSA up here. For the record, it's never going to happen. That would take an act of God to get the census to change our MSA designations. But to be clear, it would be good to have better regional designations, as the case may be. Everybody has a little bit different. I think the issue here is he's throwing in the other high desert, that is to say Lancaster and Palmdale. Even here, you are seeing some better permit numbers, pretty decent here as the case may be, but still not enough to give you the kind of labor force growth necessary to really, what I would say, allow for more and more wonderful economic growth. So still not enough, even if the trends are better. Now, in the commercial space, of course, you've heard lots of good news from the folks here at Coldwell Banker, and yeah, transactions are picking up, price drops have cooled off a bit. You've even seen some decent construction over the course of the last couple of years, and here in the high desert, and San Bernardino rather, decent numbers in terms of non-residential permits. Huge surge right after the pandemic. It's cooled off a bit, but the amount of new construction out here is still greater than it was pre-pandemic. Very solid numbers there. And on the housing side itself, we know, man, it's a lousy time to be a real estate agent, right? There's no doubt about it. Very few transactions going on. But it's a lousy time to be a real estate agent today in a different way than it was a lousy time to be a real estate agent, say, in 2011. In 2011, it was hard to be a real estate agent because you couldn't find anybody who wanted to buy anything. You had lots of listings, no one to buy. Today, it's the exact opposite problem. There are no listings. You got lots of people who want to buy. So it's a completely different kind of problem, but this problem leads to rising home prices, not falling home prices. It's a different kind of situation. Ultimately, the problem we have in housing in the United States, as well as here in California, is not enough of it. Hence, of course, we still see decent growth in terms of housing permits in the nation, even in the midst of a very cold housing market. Now, the good news for both commercial and residential real estate is the fact that banking has gotten back to normal. Look, the last couple of years, the banking system was dealing with the Federal Reserve's quantitative tightening. Remember, that was part of the anti-inflation effort. Quantitative easing created inflation. Quantitative tightening, by shrinking the money supply, cooled inflation. The problem, of course, is that by cooling inflation through quantitative tightening, you also shrunk money supply growth. And by shrinking money supply growth, you basically caused deposits in the U.S. banking system to shrink. You can see those negative numbers there. And so banks had to go out and borrow money to do lending, which is incredibly expensive, and they made it hard to get loans, and it was really complicated. Well, this year, over the last year, because the Federal Reserve has slowed down quantitative tightening, well, suddenly bank deposits are bouncing, the lending markets are working, and it is even easier to get a loan today than it was over the course of the last couple of years. Credit conditions are loosening up according to the Senior Loan Officer Survey. Good data on this particular front as well. And, of course, inflation's down, NASDAQ is up, the Federal Reserve cut 4 times last year and cooled off quantitative tightening. They didn't do anything yesterday. They stood pat, but they said 2 more rate cuts, and they're going to slow down quantitative tightening even more. So this all suggests even easier credit constraints moving over the course of the last couple of years. Your crypto portfolio went through the roof over the course of the last couple of months. For a while, Bitcoin was about $100,000. It has cooled off to about $84,000, which, of course, according to my modeling, is about $84,000 too high, give or take. Remember, if you want to know about cryptocurrency, wonderful biography of an Italian-American gentleman, worth picking up as the case may be. Now, with all this good news about an economy that's really starting to gear up, right? It really feels like this expansion is finally getting going. And yet, the mood, consumer sentiment is dropping yet again from the low levels it was at over the last couple of years. Gallup's U.S. satisfaction, very similar. We continue to see headlines such as more Americans say they're living paycheck to paycheck, all right? Now, in my house, my wife views this as a challenge, not a crisis, but that's, again, different kind of situation. 7 out of 10 college students say the country is headed off on the wrong track, mainly because their new boss told them they have to come to the office at least a couple times a week. And, of course, 70% of consumers still feel inflation outpacing incomes, despite the fact that all the data I just showed you says that isn't true. So you can tell our mood and our actual reality are not aligned. Our narrative and our reality are really off base right now. And this is the way it works. You know, I've talked about it. For the most part, narratives do reflect reality. They really do. But there's a lot of times where the narrative gets off base. Like, for example, the positive value of Bitcoin shows the power of the narrative over reality. Look, I don't like cryptocurrency for a very simple reason. Any kid with a computer degree, a degree in computer science, can make another cryptocurrency. I don't understand how any of them can be worth anything if you can have an infinite number of these things. But the narrative, at least in the short run, can dominate. And on the other side of it, I'm going to talk a lot about that federal deficit, which I've already mentioned, which, by the way, played no role whatsoever in the presidential election last year. It was a non-topic. This, yet again, it's not part of the narrative, even though it desperately needs to be. This is the world we live in. That's why a couple of years ago, Schiller wrote Narrative Economics, where he said you have to pay attention to this stuff, otherwise you remain blind to a very real mechanism for real economic change. John Maynard Keynes, well over 100 years ago, called it animal spirits. The markets are moved by animal spirits, not by reason. That's narratives. Or, of course, Will Rogers, who famously said, it isn't what we don't know that gives us trouble, it's what we know that ain't so. Well, he's talking about a false narrative over and over. This is the human condition. It's as simple as that. Now, we got into this place today, of course, largely driven by the excessive amount of stimulus. I've talked to you a lot about this over the years. They used $6 trillion in stimulus to deal with a $1.2 trillion to the economy. And it wasn't just that $50,000 net money landing in American households. In fact, that set up a huge financial bubble, which added another $200,000. Your average American household saw a 25% increase in their net worth in a year and a half. Well, no wonder we were partying like rock stars, right? And that thing just carries on. The other thing it brought, of course, was inflation. Of course it did. All that new wealth caused a surge in demand. All that new money caused a surge in money supply. Lots of demand and lots of money equals inflation. That is how it works. Inflation is caused by too much money chasing after too few goods. Always. Now, I get it. Over and over and over, you were told, oh, Americans are getting crushed by inflation. That wasn't true. I know. You know how? It's very simple. If American households were getting crushed by inflation, demand would stop. And if demand stops, what happens to prices? They go down. So the fact that inflation continued showed me just how strong consumer demand was. That is how it works, but that's not how we view things. We view things through very interesting lenses, through our own particular world lens, as the case may be. We don't see the world in its full capacity. Now, it's been an interesting ride. We had the big implosion, then we had the big bounce, and then the policy reset. And now, over the course of the last year and a half, we just started to get back to normal. And getting back to normal means, of course, buying more services and less goods and realigning and getting our incomes back in line and maybe trying to figure out how to pay off that credit card debt I built up in 2022 and one of my spending binges, as the case may be. And that's exactly why taxable sales both first surged and then started to slow down. And that slowdown there is not driven by a lack of consumer demand. It's just driven by a movement of consumer demand away from goods towards services, and the fact that overall price levels, after rising sharply, started to cool off as well. Remember, that's a nominal number. Now, when it comes to logistics, of course, was the hottest part. It was the golden child of the commercial real estate world for a couple of years, because for a couple of years, the only thing we were doing was buying stuff. You couldn't get on a plane. You couldn't go to a restaurant. So if it wasn't bolted to the floor of Walmart, I am buying this and taking it home. That's what was happening. Now, as always, commercial real estate took that short-run trend and they saw it as a long-run trend. And it wasn't. They started building tons of stuff to meet that short-run demand. And lo and behold, they built too much. What a shock. I've never seen the commercial real estate overbuild before. Never seen that. Now, of course, vacancy rates out here are coming up, as the case may be. But again, this is just a reset. It's just a little reset. Here's probably the best number I can show you. This is occupied stock up here. You can see the big surge, and it hasn't fallen. It's still there. It's still being occupied. There's still demand. We just got to re-equilibrate enough. And yeah, a little bit more will come online. But look, warehouses really are the new retail. It's as simple as that. This is not going away. You just got to let demand, if you will, catch up a little bit with supply. The key here is that outlook for consumers is still good. Real disposable incomes are rising. And because over the course of the last year we had yet another inflation of our asset bubble, we've gone from 250,000 to 360,000 above where we were pre-pandemic. So Americans still have lots of income. They have record levels of wealth. This economy will continue to grow strictly on the basis of this. This is just fine. So how do narratives get so out of whack? How can we see the world in such a weird sort of way? We've talked about this over the last couple of years. You got to start, of course, with, okay, you got to start with some new batteries. There you go. There. You got to start, of course, with Daniel Kahneman's famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Of course, it's in this book. He talks about the fact that people have two ways of thinking, type 1 and type 2. Type 2, skeptical. Wow, you're on it, man. Oh, it's triple A's, not double. Foiled again. Anyway, so system 1, of course, is very fast. System 2 is very slow. System 2 is very skeptical and logical. System 1, not skeptical at all. Logic, it just operates basically by reaction more than anything else. Now, type 2 makes us quintessentially human, but our type 2 system just isn't there all the time. It's often busy. It often gets tired. Sometimes we don't want to think at all. Who's running the show? Type 1. And look, who drove here this morning? Raise your hands. My guess is you weren't thinking about driving. Who was? You're type 1. And you're here. Let's hear it for our type 1 system, okay? Your type 1 system does a hell of a good job, but the problem is it doesn't know how to distinguish false from correct narratives. It doesn't do that. It just absorbs information as it comes into his brain, and if you're not actively watching what's going on, well, you're going to miss it. You're not going to see what's happening. And then you got to throw in another brilliant book, Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Righteous Mind just a couple years after, and this is what he makes a real point about your type 1 and type 2 thinking, which is this. Look, when it comes to type 1 thinking, it is your dominant form of thinking because it's the old-fashioned stuff. Your type 2 thinking machine was evolutionarily developed to basically support your type 1 thinking. That's what it's there for. And what that really means, of course, is that worst case scenario, if there's a conflict, type 1's going to win. But why would there be a conflict? Well, when it comes to these moral nodes, care, harm, liberty, oppression, there are these certain things within us that we are programmed to react to. And what this means is when these kind of issues come up, it isn't just that type 2 isn't around to take care of things. It's that type 1 actively stands up, looks at type 2 and says, sit down and shut up, I'm in charge now. And yet again, when it comes to these contentious social issues, we don't think rationally, we think emotionally. And that can lead us to a lot of problems. We don't think as much as we think we think. It's as simple as that, okay? And we're this, I know. And if you're wondering what this is, it's a whole bunch of people going up into an escalator into a 24-hour fitness. We don't think as much as we think we think. Now, this brings me to this graph right here, which is the whole point of this lead up, because this is everything you want. This to me told me everything I needed to know about this last election. Look, the Federal Reserve, for a bunch of years now, has asked a whole bunch of Americans, how are you doing financially? And it's on a scale of 1 to 100, okay? The top line is what the average person answered. So back in 2017, the average person said they were a 74. The average person in 2023 said they were a 72. Now, that to me is the same. I know it's a little higher, but we're all inherently unsatisfied. So the fact that it's down a little bit, statistically, that's the same thing. What's really interesting is the other two lines. Because the other two lines, they ask, how is other people in your community doing, and how are people in the rest of the country doing? And what's amazing is not only are those lines lower, but they're trending down. So what does this say? It says that the average person thinks they're okay. They're fine. But the average person thinks the average person is doing really bad. And it doesn't work that way. Look, 90% of parents think their kids are above average. It doesn't work that way, okay? It just doesn't. I got 2 kids, they're 6 and 8. Statistically, one's a dumbass. It's something I have to acknowledge. I just do. By the way, I'm pretty sure it's the younger one. I'm just saying. I'm just saying. But the kid's beautiful. He's going to make a wonderful trophy husband. I'm not worried about him. In any case, look, here's the key. When you think about this election and you ask, what happened? I said it wasn't a mandate. It was a protest. What were they protesting? Well, I don't know exactly. But I know it's a protest vote. It's very simple. You look across a whole bunch of elections, and you look at the change in consumer sentiment over the course of that administration, and then you ask whether or not that administration's party kept the White House. And when consumer confidence goes down, you're gone. Period. Now, to be clear, that's what hit Biden. It's also what hit Trump. In 2020, Trump got tossed out of office because consumer confidence went down because of the pandemic. Guess what? Trump didn't cause the pandemic. And Biden got tossed out because consumer confidence went down because of inflation. And Biden didn't cause inflation. But it doesn't matter. This is politics, people. This is how it works. Now, you might say, hey, that just proves it's the economy, stupid. But it's not. Look, people in 2020 really did have a bad economy. Their lives truly did suck. 2024, not so much. Yet, they still felt that way. Ergo, it's not the economy, stupid. It's this remote control, stupid. It's the narrative, stupid. There it goes, right? So there it is in a nutshell, as the case with me, right? This was a protest vote over nothing to protest. And if that doesn't sound just like a college campus, I don't know what does. So, with that being said, who should Trump thank for his big election win? Well, Jerome Powell, of course, because he's the guy who caused the inflation that caused consumer sentiment to go down. And I love the fact that the first thing Trump said is, I want to fire this guy. Fire him? You should be sending him flowers and candy. In any case, the real issue in our world, of course, has been something I've talked about. We don't have enough workers. It's as simple as this. Our labor force has stopped growing because we're not having kids. And the way to solve this is more immigration, right? Not complicated. And how important is immigration? How important has it been? We just got some revised numbers, and this blew me away. Over the last 15 years, this nation has added 15 million workers, of which 8 million were born overseas. Over half of all new workers in this country in the last 15 years were born overseas. So, okay, that kind of tells you something about the importance of immigration, right? That's why our economy's been growing. But it does beg the question, why is the rest of America so dead set against it? Now, the answer, of course, is because most of the increase in foreign-born workforce are in places that haven't had a lot of foreign-born workforce there before. You look at the data, it's these places over here. And, of course, that's unsettling people. Now, here we are, new administration who's picked up on the vibe that immigration is bad, and they want to throw people out. Are they going to throw people out? They're not going to throw people out. Why? Very simple. They have neither the manpower to arrest them, the detention facilities to hold them, or the courts to try them. We just don't have it. It doesn't exist. Now, you could build it, but you're going to need a whole bunch of money from Congress, and I don't know if you paid attention to this. They don't have a lot of money to give you right now. So I'm not really thinking this is going to be the case. And by the way, this isn't news because Obama deported more people than Trump did first time around. So it's not even new. Now, the interesting thing here, it's not about deportations. If you really want to talk about what happened prior to the pandemic, there was a big slowdown of people moving here, and that's what caused those big labor shortages. And almost assuredly, what you can see here is labor shortages creeping back into our economy just because of how the attitude has shifted in the United States. And, there's actually a relief for that, because while we have not actually grown a labor force much, only 7% over the course of the last decade or so, well, we have two neighbors, Canada and Mexico, who've been much better at that than we have. 17%. In Mexico, 17% in Canada. How are they doing it? In Mexico, they still have kids. Canada, lots of immigrants. Now, that is why when we slapped the tariffs on China prior to the pandemic, by the way, one of the best things Trump did in his first administration, that's why we didn't have onshoring. We had nearshoring. You can't have onshoring when there's no one to hire. It's not going to happen. But of course now, Trump tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And and tariffs on metal, as the case may be. And obviously that's a problem for our nation, as the case may be, particularly certain industries. Now, can tariffs by themselves cause a recession? No, the answer is not. They're not. It's not big enough. We're only 10% of input. Even if you put all the tariffs through, you're talking about a couple percentage point increase in the CPI over a couple of years. That's not going to cause a recession. What is going to cause problems is the fact that certain sectors of the economy are going to get pummeled. For example, if you want to think about buying a car, I suggest you do it now. Because autos, if this goes through, autos are going to go up in price by an astronomical amount because our supply chains are integrated over borders. And you got to understand, one of the dirty little things here about these tariffs, it's not just that they're adding the tariffs on, they're getting rid of tariff rebates. What does that mean? Well, let's say I make a transmission in Mexico, I bring it to the United States, I stick it in a pickup truck, and then I sell that pickup truck to Canada. When I put that pickup truck on a train and ship it to Canada, I get my tariff back on what I pay for that part coming out of Mexico. That's going to go away. And what that means is, let's say a part comes out of Mexico, goes into another part here, goes back to Mexico, puts it in another cart, comes back here, is assembled. Well, now you're paying tariff on that product 3 times. And that is where it starts to get really ugly. And of course, housing is another big problem. Construction is another big problem because of wood, because of steel, because of all those metals. And keep something in mind. This is the price indices for personal consumption and residential investment. As much as CPI has come up, the cost of building structures has come up much more, 50% to 25% over the course of the last 8 years. So that is going to get that much worse. So a new home could go up by $22,000. And the scariest part of this whole thing, of course, is retaliation. Who are they going to come at? Are they going to come at our wine industry, our whiskey industry, our microchip industry? There's going to be retaliations. So you're going to create turbulence. Maybe not a recession, but turbulence. And of course, when it comes to housing, that turbulence isn't a good thing. Look, housing, people don't want to buy housing right now, even though we don't have enough of it. Why? Because we're all told that housing has never been less affordable than it is today. And we see that in the headlines. Now, honestly, it isn't as bad as you think. If you actually look at interest rates, and you could compare it to the price of a house and incomes, you find that affordability is roughly where we were in 2003 or 4 or 5, and way better than it was in 1985. And in 1985 and in 2005, we had very active housing markets. So clearly, pricing is not that big of a deal. Now, what happened, of course, was that narrative that housing was overpriced is what held housing markets back prior to the pandemic. During the pandemic, that narrative blew up. You know, it was roughly 2008 when people finally said, you know, I'm going to stop waiting for home prices to fall. I got tons of cash, interest rates low, let's go look. And they went out to look, and they realized there's nothing to buy. And we went from, I'm waiting for home prices to fall, to 150 bids on every excuse me. There's water back here. Hopefully. There we go. Thanks. All right. Right in the middle of that good line, too. What the hell? So it was back then, of course, that suddenly prices started going through the roof. Interest rates came up, and then boom. Suddenly, of course, housing got expensive and things cooled off. But we still don't have enough supply. Now, the interesting thing here is I've already mentioned to you that it's a good time to build housing. There are buyers out there. But with that said, there's actually been a little bit of increase in inventories of new homes for sale. Why? What's going on? Well, I may have talked about filtering before. Let me explain a little about what filtering is. One of the things that makes me crazy about conversations about housing policy in California is when you hear this comment. We have a shortage of affordable housing in California. No, we don't have a shortage of affordable housing because affordability is a market outcome. It is not a market construction choice. If you built teeny tiny little homes in California, they'd still be expensive because there's not enough of them. It's as simple as that. You could pass a rule. No one can build anything more than a 1,000 square foot house in California. They're going to be really expensive 1,000 square foot houses. So you build housing, any kind of housing, to have enough supply to make it affordable. Now, what that typically means is that builders build this fancy thing here. The person sells the entry-level home, builds in the fancy new one, and then someone moves out of an apartment to move into that entry-level home. That's not happening. See that person in the middle? You will pry their 30-year fixed-rate mortgage at 2.75% from their cold, dead hand, right? So they're not moving, so home builders got to deliver directly to where it's needed, and that's the complicated part of things. It's getting it right to where it's needed. And you also have to think about the cost increases. You got to make them affordable. You got to think about how to deliver. The nice part, of course, about being up here is, yeah, you can still build affordable housing. And yes, there's still a real demand for it. We know that, as the case may be. Now, we do have the insurance problems out there, of course, driven by the fires, but don't feel too bad about it. After all, you want to see bad insurance? Go look at Florida. In fact, Florida and Texas have way more expensive insurance than we do. We're just starting to catch up because, of course, some of these fire risks. But with that in mind, ultimately, insurance is still a really small part of any household finance. It's as simple as that. It's not that big of a number. It's still less than your mortgage for the most part. Thus, it's something we can deal with. And in terms of policy, the answer is to stop trying to tell insurance companies you can't charge for risk. They have to charge for risk. Rather, what you need to do is reduce risks, which means an appropriate, of course, forest management system, which is a different conversation than, we're not going to let you raise prices because you're a corporation, ergo you're evil. That is not a narrative that helps anybody accomplish anything. And by the way, in Texas and Florida, you're starting to see the impact of property taxes and insurance in those markets. You're not seeing it here in California, which says to me, in terms of listings, which says to me, of course, that we have handled it relatively well. Now, wrapping it all up, where does this thing go? Because I just gave you a bunch of good news, but where's the bad news? Now, the Federal Reserve, as I already noted, has started to back off. And they just announced yesterday that they're not going to cut rates, but they are going to cut a couple more times. And they're going to start reducing the pace of quantitative tightening. All good for that. And that'll make credit a little bit more available. But with all this said, this is not the only problem they unleashed. It wasn't just the inflation problem. I've already mentioned the stock market bubble. Second highest PE ratio ever in our stock market at this particular point in time, even with a little bit of a cool-off we saw. By the way, if Bitcoin's a little too high for you, may I suggest investing in Fartcoin? Now, listen, I mean, look, Bitcoin's $84,000. This is a steal of a deal at 30 cents, people, okay? You can get a lot of Fartcoin. Now, for those of you who think I'm making a sophomore joke, I'm not. Go look it up on your phone. Fartcoin's the real deal. And by the way, when I got this clip shot, it had a market capitalization of $295 million. Yeah, exactly. You think this is real? And then I saw an article the other day about how these guys who do asset-backed securities, they're back in the mix. What are they doing? We don't even have a lot of securities. Are they making asset-backed cryptocurrency? Run for the hills, people, all right? And this, of course, brings me to Warren Buffett's famous comment, to be fearful when others are greedy. People are getting greedy. Watch out. And, of course, let's not forget that deficit. 6% of GDP, 100% debt to GDP, enormous obligations for Social Security and Medicare coming up, mainly driven by a huge increase in spending. Well, Doge is going to fix it, right? No, Doge isn't going to fix it, okay? You can't. Look, all personnel compensation and benefits, everything, military and civilian, adds up to 8.6% of what they spend. You can't fix this by laying some people off. You just can't. You got to go in, fix Medicare, Social Security, defense. You can't do that without legal changes. You have to have Congress do it. And honestly, Congress right now can't account. I don't know how Congress goes to the bathroom right now. They're so dysfunctional, right? So here's where the rubber hits the road. Okay, so our government's borrowing more and more, and we're not buying that debt. We're not saving enough. Who is? And the answer is the rest of the world. And you can see that in terms of the widening current account deficit, which is right now approaching 5% of GDP. The largest it ever was negative 6% in GDP in the run-up to the Great Recession. And no, that comparison should not make you happy, okay? And on top of that, our net asset position, the worst it's ever been at negative 8% of GDP. What's interesting is we're on a consumption binge. Our government is borrowing like crazy. And our current account deficit is terrible. You think the rest of the world will be running away from us. They're not. They're lining up. Look at the dollar, 30-year high. What in the hell is going on? Well, the answer is the rest of the world's narrative is not about our deficit any more than ours is. Their narrative is, wow, the U.S. is where good returns are. Oh, look at their stock market, best stock market in the world. Look at the cryptocurrency market, best one in the world. It's a dubious distinction. Even their property prices are going to better here. So the rest of the world is coming here and investing in these, and that money is moving around and eventually ends up buying government debt. Well, this is a wonderful game until the rest of the world suddenly doesn't want to invest here anymore. And for those of you who are thinking about that stock market sell-off last week, one of the things you typically, when you see a stock market sell-off, you immediately see bond prices go up, interest rates come down. It didn't budge. What did happen last week when this market swooned was the dollar went down. And that told you everything you needed to know. It is no longer a function of the market being linked to interest rates, but now the market is linked to dollars. And if the market dives, the dollar dives. And if the dollar dives, interest rates go through the roof, and that is the rubber hits the road. Now, when you look at the economy today, look, you just go to this final column here. The differences couldn't be more profound. At the very top, Trump has inherited the healthiest economy since 2004. There's no doubt about it. You have a low unemployment rate, household disposable real incomes are up sharply, your household debt to income is down, net worth is up. Never have Americans been better off. And yet, look at consumer sentiment. Look how weak it is. So we're doing great and we're upset. And then you look down here at our external accounts and our asset markets, and what you actually see is Trump has inherited the most unbalanced economy we've seen, right? When you look at the current account deficit, maybe on part what Obama took over in 2008. So yeah, we have a really weird place because our economy desperately needs to be cooled off. And yet Trump's mandate, in as much as it exists, is to make our lives even better. You can't do that. You can't have both of those things at the same time. And this is the rub. How does this shake out? How far does it go? Look, I could see the trade war really setting things off, right? Now, this could get ramped up. Could that set it off? Enough, sure. It could set off that external account. Here's the truest headline I found out there, all right? Nobody wants to drink sparkling wine from the Midwest. Could not agree more with that particular statement, right? And yes, sentiment's starting to dive again. So you start to see a situation by which, wow, things are not quite right. And my guess is things will calm down in D.C. You will continue to see growth. The end is not there, but we all have to be on pins and needles. We all have to be paying attention because there is an end to this pier. Just a function of when we need to see it. And when Lutnick says Trump policies are worth it, even if they lead to recession, I agree with him, but not necessarily for the reasons he would think. I agree with him because maybe a recession would be good for us. But we'll see. We'll see. So are we out of the woods? We were never in the woods. The economy has downshifted to normal. Consumer demand remains strong. The expansion should continue. Headwinds will intensify. The most important number to pay attention to is the nominal value of the dollar. Pay attention to the dollar. As for the high desert, the opportunities up here are still enormous. It's still magnificent. Incomes are up. Spending is up. The kind of industrial growth you're seeing is up. Huge amount of potential out here. Needs to be housing driven. Obviously, the problem in the housing market is how do you get people to come up here and buy these expensive homes? Expensive because of materials, expensive because of interest rates. That is the biggest complication you face. With that said, the macro conditions could challenge your local growth scenario. You got to pay attention to that. And of course, the real issue is the narrative is running amok and it's creating political and policy chaos. And that's the biggest problem we have of all. And that's weird, because this shouldn't be happening this way. We live in the information age. The vast majority of the data I just showed you, you can get on your phone right now if you download the app called FRED, which stands for Federal Reserve Economic Data, where it has 1.3 million data sets, which you can throw into your laptop and do all sorts of stuff. Why is it that when we live in the information age, we're the stupidest we've ever been? Now, a solution to this comes from the Pew Charitable Trust, the Future Truth and Information Line, where he says, new information platforms feed the ancient instinct people have to find information that syncs with their perspective. The information environment will not improve. The problem is human nature. Ain't that the truth? We don't live in the information age. We live in the age of confirmation bias. We live in an age where, no matter what I believe, no matter how silly it is, I will go to the internet and I will find someone who agrees with me. That's why I know Australia is not a real place. It doesn't exist. And the earth is flat. And, of course, real incomes are going down, and Gen Z is going to have a terrible life. And, our economy is terrible, and Americans are suffering. Look, these conspiracy theories that inflict our world don't start out there. They don't start with our elected leaders. They don't start with the newspapers. They start with us. And until we recognize that this is inside us, that we have to be a lot more humble and understand that what we think is happening may not actually be happening. But the most dangerous thing is something that that ain't so. Well, then maybe we can get ourselves back into the right place. Thank you very much, everybody. As always, wonderful to be here.
Chris, thank you. I find interesting, real quick, is Dow and the S&P dropped 2 or 3 points, and everyone thinks it's the end of the world. Bitcoin drops 20%, and they're like, it was a bad week.
Bad hour.
Bad hour. Anyway, Thank you very much. And that wraps it up for today. Thank you for attending.